The summer of 1944 witnessed the rapid collapse of the German hold on Western Europe after the Normandy breakout. Allied High Command, eager to end the war before Christmas, sought an audacious maneuver to bypass the formidable Siegfried Line. Field Marshal Montgomery's Operation Market Garden was conceived as a daring combined arms assault across the Netherlands. The plan called for 3 full airborne divisions to seize a string of 9 major bridges along a single 60-mile corridor. This aerial market component would secure the crossing points, allowing a massive armored thrust known as the Garden component to pour into Germany's industrial Ruhr Valley. The success of the entire operation hinged upon the final, most distant crossing, the road bridge over the lower Rhine at Arnhem. Securing Arnhem meant establishing a gateway for the final, decisive blow against the Third Reich. The British 1st Airborne Division, famed as the Red Devils, was tasked with this most difficult and critical objective. Planners believed the operation would be a swift, 2-day affair facing only weak, disorganized resistance from the retreating Wehrmacht. They fatally underestimated the resilience of the German forces regrouping in the quiet Dutch countryside. The sheer scale of the airborne drop was meant to shock and paralyze the enemy long enough for the ground forces to arrive. This strategy was predicated on speed, surprise, and flawless coordination between the airborne and the ground troops. Intelligence failures concerning the exact location of German armored units proved to be a catastrophic oversight from the start. The Arnhem Bridge, the ultimate goal, represented both a massive strategic prize and a perilous, distant objective. This single bridge over the lower Rhine became the focus of the entire European campaign for a few bloody, desperate days. The gamble was immense, and the price of failure would be paid in the lives of the elite paratroopers who jumped first. German High Command, though initially surprised by the mass parachute drops, was not entirely unprepared for this kind of action. Crucially, 2 veteran SS Panzer divisions, the 9th and 10th, had been quietly pulled back to the Arnhem area for rest and refitting. These were battle-hardened troops, not the elderly and ill-equipped reserves the Allied planners had expected to encounter. Their presence was a complete and devastating shock to the lightly armed British airborne troops descending into the area. General Feldmarschall Walther Model, commander of Army Group B, was forced to flee his headquarters just moments after the drops began. His immediate, aggressive reaction was to quickly form a defensive line and mobilize the unexpected panzer assets to counter the threat. The German response was swift, professional, and brutally efficient in utilizing the local terrain and unexpected armored advantage. Tanks and self-propelled guns immediately began to block the key routes leading from the landing zones toward the Arnhem city center. This unexpected armor proved to be the single most decisive factor in slowing the British advance on the crucial first day. The paratroopers, equipped primarily with small arms and light anti-tank weapons, were ill-suited to fight a pitched battle against tanks. The Germans quickly realized the true objective was the bridges and moved to isolate the airborne forces before they could concentrate. The British hope of a quick dash to the Rhine was immediately shattered by the roar of panzer engines in the woods. Model's decisive and rapid commitment of his armored reserves completely upset the entire Allied timetable for Market Garden. What should have been a police action for the Germans quickly escalated into a major defensive battle of attrition. The element of surprise, which was the cornerstone of the operation, was lost almost before the parachutes even touched the ground. The initial German complacency evaporated, replaced by a steely determination to crush the airborne invasion at its furthest point. The drop itself was a magnificent sight, with thousands of parachutes blooming across the Dutch sky in perfect formation. The initial landings were largely unopposed, allowing the British paratroopers to organize and collect their equipment efficiently. The men of the 1st Airborne Division were among the most highly trained and determined soldiers in the entire Allied army. Their primary mission was simple: gather up and move quickly to the main road bridge, which was a few miles to the east. Colonel John Frost's 2nd Battalion was selected to lead the spearhead, tasked with securing the northern end of the Rhine crossing. The troops quickly learned that the designated drop zones were frustratingly far from their critical objective in the city center. This distance was mandated by Bomber Command to avoid anti-aircraft fire, a decision that proved strategically costly. The long march into Arnhem immediately presented the opportunity for the waiting German forces to intervene and organize their defense. The paratroopers faced the immediate challenge of navigating dense woods and restrictive urban terrain with limited mapping. As they began their advance, the air of routine quickly dissolved into skirmishes with small but effective German blocking forces. Every hedgerow, every bridge, and every small cluster of houses became a point of unexpected and fierce resistance. The division's main body soon found itself entangled in a slow, grinding battle that consumed precious hours and momentum. The swift, surgical strike intended by Market Garden was already devolving into a grueling infantry struggle. The failure to land directly on the bridge was a tactical decision that ultimately guaranteed the difficulty of the battle to come. Despite the mounting friction, Frost's battalion pushed forward with relentless energy, driven by the knowledge of their mission's urgency. They were the only hope for securing the critical Rhine crossing before the Germans could fully fortify their defenses. A key part of the British plan relied on flawless, consistent radio communication between the scattered airborne units and the ground column. The Airborne Division was issued new, powerful but untested 22-set radios for their long-distance communications. Almost immediately upon landing, the radios failed to penetrate the wooded terrain, or simply malfunctioned due to faulty design. The lack of reliable communication became a disaster of unforeseen proportions for the isolated division. Commanders quickly lost the ability to coordinate the scattered battalions, leaving the advance fragmented and unguided. Crucially, they could not communicate their predicament to the main ground column, the British XXX Corps, advancing from the south. The absence of radio contact meant that the overall battle commander, Major General Roy Urquhart, was essentially cut off from his troops. At one point, General Urquhart himself disappeared for 2 days while attempting to move forward to a forward position. This created a massive vacuum in command and control, leaving individual battalion commanders to fight their own isolated battles. The German forces, meanwhile, were able to intercept British messages and listen to the frantic, fragmented radio traffic. This intelligence advantage allowed the Germans to anticipate British movements and deploy their counterattacks with deadly accuracy. The British troops fighting in the urban maze of Arnhem were left to rely on runners and word of mouth for critical updates. The radio failure was a silent, invisible enemy that crippled the division's ability to concentrate its strength for the final assault. This communication breakdown guaranteed that the battle would be fought as a series of disconnected, desperate last stands. It was a fatal technical flaw that nullified the superior training and fighting spirit of the entire Airborne Division. As the main body of the 1st Airborne Division was slowed and bogged down in the western outskirts, Colonel Frost made a vital decision. He resolved to press on regardless of the growing German resistance, leading his 2nd Battalion on a separate route. Frost chose the northern, less traveled route through the dense, narrow streets of Arnhem, moving with relentless aggression. His men fought through determined German roadblocks and skirmish lines, using speed and surprise to avoid becoming fully encircled. They covered the long distance to the bridge, street by street, often engaging in fierce, unexpected bursts of close-quarters fighting. The column was constantly harassed by German forces, forcing them to expend precious ammunition and sustain mounting casualties. By nightfall of the first day, September 17, Frost's force had reached the massive steel structure of the Arnhem Road Bridge. They secured the northern approach and established a small, precarious perimeter around a cluster of buildings and rampways. This was the single, fleeting success of the entire airborne operation at the far end of the Market Garden corridor. Frost's battalion had achieved the main objective, but they were now entirely cut off from the rest of the division and all friendly forces. They had essentially captured an island in a sea of rapidly mobilizing German troops and heavy armor. The Germans were stunned that a single, lightly armed battalion had managed to penetrate their newly established cordon. Frost's achievement was an act of sheer will and determination, but it sealed the fate of his battalion to a brutal siege. He knew that the only way for the overall plan to succeed was for them to hold the bridge until the arrival of the ground forces. Colonel Frost's small force of men quickly transformed the buildings around the northern ramp of the bridge into a miniature fortress. The German response to the successful seizure of the bridge was immediate, massive, and overwhelmingly forceful. Elements of the 9th SS Panzer Division quickly encircled the position, isolating the paratroopers entirely. The defenders were soon under continuous attack from German tanks, self-propelled guns, and determined infantry assaults. They turned houses, cellars, and school buildings into firing points, often fighting hand-to-hand in the ruins and rubble. The main challenge for the British was the absence of sufficient heavy weapons to effectively counter the German armor. Despite the severe disadvantage, the paratroopers repelled wave after wave of German counterattacks for 3 agonizing days. They used their limited PIAT anti-tank weapons and collected German Panzerfausts with deadly ingenuity. The relentless German fire quickly started to consume the houses, forcing the paratroopers to fight from burning shells of buildings. Smoke, fire, and the constant sound of explosions created a deafening, terrifying environment for the trapped defenders. Casualties mounted with every hour, and the medical supplies and clean water quickly dwindled to almost nothing. The men's iron resolve was all that kept the perimeter from collapsing under the immense weight of the German onslaught. German commanders, initially confident of a swift victory, became increasingly frustrated by this tiny pocket of defiance. They simply could not believe that such a small, isolated force could maintain such a devastatingly effective resistance. The fight at the bridge was less about tactics and more about the raw, desperate courage of individual British soldiers. German commanders at the divisional and corps level initially viewed the airborne landing as a nuisance that would be quickly contained. General-Lieutenant Wilhelm Bittrich, commanding the 2 SS Panzer Corps, at first saw the paratroopers as a distraction to be crushed easily. This confidence was rooted in the knowledge that they possessed overwhelming superiority in tanks and heavy artillery. The German plan was simple: isolate the scattered British battalions and then systematically eliminate the bridgehead as a final step. They allocated only what they considered to be sufficient forces to deal with Frost's men, anticipating a quick surrender. The stubborn refusal of the paratroopers to break quickly exposed the flaw in the German commander's initial assessment. The defense was far more coordinated and resilient than any of the German generals had expected from an encircled airborne unit. Every attempt to take the bridgehead with localized attacks was bloodily repulsed by the determined defenders. The German miscalculation was not just tactical but also psychological. They underestimated the sheer fighting spirit of the Red Devils. This tenacity forced the Germans to commit more and more of their valuable SS Panzer troops to the localized fight. The continuous engagement at the bridge became a massive drain on German resources and disrupted their larger defensive strategy. Bittrich and other commanders grew visibly exasperated as their timetable for crushing the entire operation was delayed by days. They began to realize that this isolated pocket was a center of genuine, world-class military resistance, not a mere mopping-up exercise. The German leadership had assumed that a lack of supplies and communications would force an immediate capitulation. Instead, they encountered a fierce, desperate determination that turned the bridge into a symbol of Allied defiance. The second and third days of the siege at the Arnhem Bridge were an unparalleled nightmare for the trapped paratroopers. The Germans unleashed the full might of their localized firepower, including direct fire from tanks and heavy mortars. The small perimeter shrank relentlessly as buildings were reduced to smoking piles of rubble and the wounded mounted quickly. A makeshift casualty clearing station in the cellars of one of the houses overflowed with injured men who could not be evacuated. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, cordite, and dust, making it almost impossible to breathe or see clearly. The defenders faced an unceasing barrage of fire, with every square foot of their position being targeted multiple times. Food and water became critical concerns, forcing the men to resort to desperate measures to find any source of liquid refreshment. British attempts to relieve the beleaguered force were blocked miles away by the surrounding, reinforced German lines. The men in the bridgehead knew they were fighting alone, completely isolated from all possible help and support. Yet, every single German rush was met with a concentrated volley of fire from the remaining, determined defenders. The paratroopers' discipline remained intact, and their fire control was exemplary, conserving ammunition for the critical moments. The fierce resistance forced the German commanders to continually rethink and escalate the violence of their attacks. The constant sound of combat was a clear, ringing indication to all German forces that the heart of the resistance had not yet been broken. This small, burning perimeter at the northern end of the bridge became the focal point of the most intense fighting of the entire campaign. The paratroopers pushed themselves far beyond the breaking point of normal military expectation during the siege. Fatigue became a constant, crippling enemy, with men fighting without sleep for 72 hours or more straight. Thirst was a more immediate problem than even the German shells, as all accessible water sources were quickly destroyed. The mental strain of being surrounded and under constant, heavy fire for days on end was almost unbearable. Despite the circumstances, the men's morale remained astonishingly high, fueled by the example of their leaders and their mutual reliance. Acts of individual heroism were common, with men risking their lives to fetch ammunition or pull a wounded comrade to safety. Many of the severely wounded refused to be evacuated, insisting on holding their positions and firing their weapons until they could no longer move. The sheer determination of the British soldiers transformed their position into a symbol of defiance against overwhelming odds. They believed they were fighting for the quick end of the war and for the survival of the main British armored column. Their refusal to surrender was not merely stubbornness but a disciplined execution of their mission under the worst possible conditions. The German officers who later examined the ruins of the bridgehead expressed profound respect for the tenacity of the British defense. This battle showcased the ultimate limits of human endurance when combined with an elite soldier's training and sense of duty. The spirit of the Red Devils, beaten but not broken, became the lasting legacy of the battle for Arnhem. By the morning of September 20th, the position at the Arnhem Bridge was no longer tenable, having been reduced to smoking ruins. Colonel Frost himself had been severely wounded and the command passed to the next highest-ranking uninjured officer. The remaining defenders, out of ammunition and with their positions completely untenable, were finally overwhelmed by German armor. For the rest of the 1st Airborne Division, the battle shifted to the wooded, suburban area of Oosterbeek, west of the city. The shattered remnants of the British battalions converged there, forming a desperate, tight defensive perimeter around the town. This new pocket was an act of last-ditch consolidation, attempting to hold a secure zone until the ground forces could finally punch through. The perimeter was small, densely packed, and relentlessly bombarded by German artillery and rocket fire without cessation. The fighting here was characterized by brutal house-to-house combat amidst the quaint Dutch villas and gardens. The paratroopers dug in, using the dense terrain and the ruined buildings to their best advantage, fighting for every inch of ground. Their defense at Oosterbeek became a final, grueling test of their will, lasting for several more agonizing days. They maintained a fierce concentration of fire, continually shocking the German attackers with their stubborn, aggressive defense. The Germans continued to pour troops and armor into the attack, realizing the operation was a major effort to destroy the division entirely. The fate of the entire division rested on the hope of a link-up that grew more distant and unlikely with every passing hour. Despite the mounting casualties and delays, the German commanders knew they were ultimately victorious in the tactical sense. The British airborne units were isolated, running out of supplies, and could not be reinforced by the XXX Corps. The German focus shifted from merely defending the bridges to the systematic annihilation of the trapped 1st Airborne Division. The continuous shelling of the Oosterbeek perimeter was designed to break the defenders' will and force a mass surrender. German infantry and tanks launched concentrated, coordinated assaults, slowly shrinking the perimeter meter by bloody meter. The defenders fought until their last magazines were empty, sometimes throwing stones and empty tins when ammunition was exhausted. The German commanders expressed a grudging admiration for the discipline and sheer fighting power of the British paratroopers. They were forced to commit forces that could have been used to reinforce other parts of the crumbling Western Front. The sheer cost of crushing the British airborne resistance surprised and angered the senior German leadership. It was a final, terrible, slow-motion victory, bought at a much higher price than they had ever intended to pay. The final German breakthrough came with overwhelming force, signaling the end of the organized British resistance. After 9 days of what was arguably the fiercest fighting on the Western Front, the order to withdraw was finally given. Under the cover of a massive artillery barrage and a violent storm, the remaining men of the 1st Airborne began their perilous escape. In a desperate night crossing known as Operation Berlin, a fraction of the division managed to cross the Rhine to safety. Over 7,000 British paratroopers were killed, wounded, or captured during the epic and tragic Battle of Arnhem. The campaign ultimately failed to achieve its strategic goal, and the war was not ended by Christmas as Montgomery had hoped. Yet, the legacy of the Red Devils' refusal to break at the Arnhem Bridge became immortalized in military history. Colonel Frost's small perimeter held a vital crossing for 3 days against some of the most elite and heavily armed German troops. Their sacrifice forced the Germans to commit valuable armored assets, disrupting the overall German defense for days. The battle is a timeless example of how human courage and tenacity can temporarily defeat superior firepower and numbers. the men of the 1st Airborne Division demonstrated a degree of commitment that has since inspired generations of soldiers worldwide. The bridge at Arnhem forever stands as a monument to their incredible endurance, a place where heroes simply refuse to yield. The phrase "a bridge too far" became the common, poignant summary of the magnificent failure and immortal heroism of the entire operation.